Welcome to session 5 of our class on understanding biblical literature. We finished with slide 35 in the presentation concerning chapter 1. So we'll pick up with slide 36 and talk about English translations since 1611. Now, in slide 37, we have the English Revised Version, which was completed somewhere between 1881 and 1885. It was the first modern English translation to make use of modern principles of textual criticism. Again, that is the textual criticism is the science of taking all of the copies that we have of any particular passage and determining which is the best text. Now there's a lot of detail to that, and a lot of different parts to that are beyond just a simple comparing copies. But the English Revised Version was the first modern English translation to make use of that. Then you have the American Standard Version, which was produced in 1901, and it was a revision of the English Revised Version. And then lastly, produced in the mid-20th century, the Revised Standard Version translators used the best of modern scholarship at the time, while also using language that would be appropriate for public and private worship. So those are the three modern translations. Again, modern being kind of relative, the late 1800s to about 1950 or so. And then when we come down the line a little bit more, we have the New American Standard Bible and the New King James Version, the New Revised Standard Version, the New International Version, and the English Standard Version. Now, the New King James, while it does update the language of the King James Version, it still maintains the use of the inferior Greek text. As we said, that inferior Greek text is known as the Textus Receptus, or the received text. Translations that do not use the Textus Receptus draw from an eclectic Greek text. The eclectic Greek text, or the eclectic approach, allows translation committees to sort through the different manuscripts in order to use the manuscript or manuscripts that they believe best resembles the original writings, or the autograph, which is the term that we use for the actual paper and writing on which Paul or James or any other writer wrote his material. Now, it's important to point out here that no translation is perfect, and each translation committee has its own pre-understanding as they do this very important work. And what we mean by this pre-understanding is that generally whatever group puts together a committee, they're going to get people who are mostly like-minded concerning their beliefs, and to a certain extent that translation then is going to lean toward what they believe. Okay, such as evangelicals often lean toward the NIV or the NASB, the New International Version, or the New American Standard Version, New American Standard Bible, while mainline Protestants use the New Revised Standard Versions, and Christians who operate in the Reformed tradition often study the ESV, the English Standard Version. But the fact is that, again, no translation is perfect. You're going to find mistakes. You're going to find things you will disagree with. But what you need to do is choose a translation, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, but choose a translation that is as free of bias as can be found. And I personally will lean toward those that are as close to the text as can be done. But like I said, we'll go into more of that in just a minute. But the next thing we want to note on slide 39 are the difficulties of translation. The fact is that no two words are exactly alike. There are nuances that are found in one language that might not be found in another. And when you think about the fact that we are we are now in 2018 free, or I'm sorry, we are removed some 1900 years from the original writings and from the use of the Greek language. I think the Greek language was used probably up until 200 or 300, maybe a little later, AD. But so we're probably 1700 or 1800 years removed from the use of the Greek language, the end of the use of the Greek language. But so with that time difference, and and the cultural difference, and the many other areas of difference, you're going to have those things factoring into the idea of word meaning. Now, this is true, the idea that no two words are exactly alike. This is true even in between modern languages. But again, there's that added level of difficulty when you have such a long period of time between the language that you're trying to translate out of and the language that you're trying to translate into. Again, we call that the source language, from where you want to translate, to the receptor language, which you want to translate into. Next, notice that the vocabulary of any two languages vary in size. There are only so many words in the Greek New Testament, and there are only so many words in the Hebrew and Aramaic Old Testament. So, we have in English a greater vocabulary. So, and sometimes there are several words that mean pretty much the same thing, but there may be only one word for that in Greek, and you're trying to decide which one of our words is a closer fit to what was meant in the original language. And so that is also a difficulty. Next, languages utilize syntax differently. Now, what do we mean by syntax? We mean word order. We mean different phrases or different usages of words that mean one thing in this language, but not necessarily the same thing in the receptor language. For example, you have the Hebrew language. The normal word order of a Hebrew sentence is verb, subject, object. That is to say, the subject of the verb comes after the verb. So if we if we have a sentence concerning Abraham that says Abraham went to his tent, okay, Abraham went to his home. In Hebrew, literally, the translation would be he went. And then the next word would be Abraham. So to bring that over into English, we say Abraham went. The he of the verb is Abraham. Okay? So, he went, Abraham, to his home. Okay? In Greek, you have the word order of subject, verb, object, kind of like we do in English. So that's the normal word order. And so again, you have this different syntax, especially with the Hebrew and the Aramaic. Now, one other note on syntax is that in the Hebrew or the Greek, those two languages sometimes will take one of the words that comes later in the normal order of the sentence, and they'll put it first in the sentence. And they do that in order to emphasize that part of the sentence or the thought that they're trying to get across, the message they're trying to get across. They want to emphasize that particular part of it. So again, whether it's in Hebrew or Greek, our sentence that we used earlier, Abraham went to his home, if the writer wants to emphasize that it was his home that Abraham went to, he wants to put emphasis on that particular fact in the sentence, then he would take the word to the words to his home and put it first in the sentence in his writing the sentence down. So it would be in English that would come across as to his home Abraham went. That's the way we would emphasize it. Or we would say Abraham went to his home, as opposed to some other place. Or, it was very important in the context that Abraham went to that place. So what happens, though, is in our translations, this is not always brought out. So it helps. What I'm about to say is not to imply that you have to know Greek or Hebrew or Aramaic in order to go to heaven. That's certainly not the case. But in order to see the text for what it, I guess you could say, the intricacies, to help the text come alive and to get the most out of what is being said is possible when you learn these languages. Now, again, all I'm saying is that, well, let me just illustrate it this way. reading the Bible in English is certainly, or any other language, is certainly it certainly puts a person in a position to where they can know what God wants, and they can go to heaven on what they can read there. But the illustration I'll use here is, and a lot of you being younger will not understand this to the fullest extent, but the idea of watching a TV or a movie in black and white and watching it in color. Okay, the color is more pleasing to the eye. It makes everything vivid. Okay, especially if the color has been added to the black and white film in a good way. There are some that have been done badly, but if the color has been added in a really good way to a black and white film or a black and white TV show from many years ago, then it just brings that more to life, you might say. And let me just give you an example. In the passage where John the Baptizer has been born, and it comes to the point where it's time for John to be named, the baby to be named. Let's just go over there real quick and read that passage. I believe that's in Luke. Luke chapter 1, verse 58, or 59 beginning. And it happened that on the 8th day they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to call him Zacharias, after his father, or after the name of his father. But his mother answered and said, "No, indeed, but he shall be called John." Now, that was the New American Standard that I just read, and it brings it out. It brings the force of the Greek out a whole lot better than other translations, because let's see, if you go to the English Standard Version, the ESV, and you come to verse 60, but his mother answered, "No, he shall be called John." And then in the New King James, in verse 60, it again simply says, "No, he shall be called John." I'm trying to find another translation that might help us a little bit. The American Standard of 1901 says, "Not so," with just a semicolon beside it. "Not so, but he shall be called John." Now, the NIV does a pretty good job here, and it says in verse 60, "But his mother spoke up and said, 'No,' with an exclamation mark. He is to be called John." So, the New American Standard says, "No, indeed." The NIV says, "No," with an exclamation mark, and that's pretty much the way that she said it. You can almost, we don't want to add anything to the scriptures for sure, but it's almost as if, like like the way we would do it would be more like, put our fist down on the desk and just say, no, he shall be called John. They want to name him Zacharias, and she says, no. And, whether she did it with that much force or whatever in her tone, what we do know is that the Greek language in that word, when she says no, it's a very strong no. Okay, it's not just simply, no, I think he should be called John. No, it's a very strong no, and that's what's brought out again by the NIV with the exclamation mark on the word no. So that's part of the syntax. And the only way that we can bring that into English, or the only way that a person can show that in English, if it's spoken, is to put emphasis on it. We don't have another spelling of the word no that shows the emphasis that we're trying to put on it. Greek has this other spelling of the word no that shows the emphasis, whether it's written or spoken. But in English, the only way we can show it if it's spoken is a tone change, and the only way we can show it in the written form is to put that exclamation mark on it, like the NIV did, or like the New American Standard says, no indeed. Okay, although they did not put an exclamation mark on it in the New American Standard. So that's some ideas concerning syntax. And then languages have different stylistic preferences. Again, just the style of writing is different in different languages. All right. The next thing is in slide 40. Mark Strauss is quoted here, where the quotation marks are given. Translation entails reproducing the meaning of a text that is in one language, that is the source language that we've talked about, reproducing the meaning of a text that is in one language as fully as possible in another language, which is called, again, the receptor language. And that's the goal of any translation exercise, any translation project. If you want to bring a Spanish letter or document or whatever into English, then if you're going to effectively communicate what was in Spanish or German or French or Arabic or whatever, if you're going to effectively communicate the message that's in the original language, you have to be as faithful to the original text as you can, but also put it in such language, in the receptor language, in English in this case, as closely as you can to the original, that you can get the meaning across. And sometimes that's hard to do. There are some ways of writing in different languages that don't translate well into English. And that's what we run into sometimes with translation. Next, on slide 41, we have two approaches to translation. These two approaches are called the formal approach and the functional approach. Let's define those in the next slide. Slide 42 is the first one. Characteristics of the formal approach are It attempts to maintain the structure of the source language as much as possible. Um, Again, you know, when we translate from the Hebrew, it doesn't make good English to say he went, Abraham, to his home. It just doesn't, I mean, it doesn't come across well. I mean, the person reading the English of that would have to know that the normal word order in Hebrew is verb, subject, object. Okay? So we have to change some things, and in a sense, you know, in that case, we're not changing anything. We're just changing the order of the words. That's all we're doing. And sometimes, again, doing a literal word-for-word translation is just not possible, or it's going to be very wooden or very hard to understand when you get it into the language that you want to translate it into. Well, let me try to give you another example. Well, for some reason, oh, here we go. Let's go to John chapter 1. And in John chapter 1, we are familiar with most of the English translations, which say, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Okay? But if you literally read in this case from the Greek, we say in our English translations we say in the beginning, okay, because you know there's only one beginning of anything. But in Greek it says in beginning. There is no the there. In beginning, literally, again, he was the Word, okay? But the he, in this case, is actually, you know, in the very word itself is non-personal, okay? But the Word is the subject of the sentence because of the form that it's in, and then the was is the verb, okay? The verb to be. So in beginning he was the Word, and the Word he was toward the God, because the article the is there in front of the word God. So he's toward the God, and God, he was the Word. This one was in beginning toward the God, or with the God. And all, or all things, verse 3, through him were made. And without him, not one thing, without him were made not one thing. So, or literally, not one is the literal translation. So, you know, that's the idea of the formal approach, that's a word for word, literal word for word translation from the Greek to English. But you see that even a word for word translation is not always the best. So literally, what you have is that the formal approach, even the formal approach, which attempts to maintain the structure of the source language, still has to move some things around and in some cases adds something. And a lot of the times in your translations, if you have a translation that does this, there will be italicized words, words that are slightly bent. They're in italics, and that's a word that the translators have added to help us better understand what's being said. So, my point, what I was trying to say a while ago, is that the formal approach also takes some functional approach method to get the formal approach across. Okay, so the formal approach attempts to maintain structure of the source language. And then it is the next point is that the formal approach is less sensitive to the receptor language, that in this case would be English, which may result in an awkward translation. And as translations have become more modern, as English has evolved, translators are doing their best to keep that awkwardness out of it, but they're not always completely successful because they're trying to, again, stay as close to the original as possible. Now, the types of translations that fall in this category of the formal approach, as close to the structure of the source language, as close to the words that are used without adding anything, to change it in any way, would be the New American Standard, the New American Standard Bible. What's being used in most cases is the New American Standard Bible 1995 update. They're actually coming out now in the next year or two with a new update of the New American Standard. The ESV, the English Standard Version, falls under this type of translation approach. The New Revised Standard Version and the Holman Christian Standard Bible, so the NRSV and the HCSB, are translations that fall into this category with the New American Standard and the ESV. All right, next in slide 43, characteristics of the functional approach is that the people who approach the text with this method, is that they try for a thought-for-thought approach, which focuses on today's language. So therefore it's less sensitive to the source language, which may result in distorted meaning, since form helps communicate meaning. Now, let's think about this for a moment. Okay? The functional approach, or sometimes it's called dynamic equivalence, okay? Whereas, the formal approach is sometimes called word for word or literal, okay? The functional approach is sometimes called dynamic equivalent, and basically what is being said here concerning this functional approach is that the translators are looking at the text and they are saying to the reader, by the method that they use, we know what the text says, but here's what we think the text means. Okay? Now, maybe 95, 98% of the time, that's not going to be very different from what the text actually means, from what the text actually says. Okay? But there are other times when when you have a situation where it removes the meaning, or the translation that is put down on paper in English is somewhat removed from what the text actually says, because this translator or set of translators thinks that it means this, when it really doesn't mean exactly that in the original. And basically what that means is that, at least in some cases, in those translations that use the functional approach, is we basically have a commentary instead of a translation. Now again, I quoted the NIV a while ago and showed that it had the best translation, or had the best way of saying something and concerning what Elizabeth said in Luke chapter 1 and verse 60. The NIV had the best translation of that, and the way they formed it in the English. But the NIV is one of the translations that uses the functional approach. So while I recognize, and this is me personally, okay, but I have, some experience to back it up. For me, using the NIV is basically using it for a commentary. Okay, that's, if I lay the NIV down on the table and I put 4 or 5 other translations on the table and I want to compare them all, I don't do that anymore. I use my computer to do that. I put one translation here and another translation there, and I can make 5 windows if I want to use 5 translations, and make my comparisons across the screen. But if I put the NIV up there to compare to everything else, I don't put as much stock in the NIV as I would the others that I would choose. Okay, such as the New American Standard, the New King James, the English Standard Version, or maybe the Holman Christian Standard Bible. Those are again the formal approach, the word for word, literal as much as possible. That's the approach that I more agree with, okay? But the functional approach would be, like the NIV, the New Century Version, or the New Living Translation. Those are using the functional approach, and they're doing that thought for thought translation, focusing on the receptor language, and they're less sensitive to the source language, which does result in distorted meaning, since form, syntax, helps communicate meaning. Okay, so I hope you understand that the functional approach, the dynamic equivalent approach, is in my understanding and the understanding of a lot of other people. It's just not the best approach to translating God's Word, okay, or translating anything, because again, if you don't give the meaning of what is said, or if you don't give what is said in the closest that you can to the original, while not sacrificing thought in English, the functional approach is just not good. It's the formal approach. Now let's show you a chart on slide 44 of the kind of a continuum to see where a lot of these translations lie on this line. To the left is the more formal or the formal approach, the word for word or literal, okay? And on the other end is the more functional or the functional approach or the dynamic equivalence approach, okay? Thought for thought approach instead of word for word. And you can see that, you know, the King James and the ASV of 1901 are as far to the left there under the more formal approach, with the New American Standard, New King James, ESV moving just slightly to the right, but still in that category. The RSV, the Holman Christian Standard Bible, the New Revised Standard Version, the New English Translation, I think is the way that's supposed to be said, is moving a little bit more to the right. The New American Bible, or I'm sorry, the New Amplified Bible is getting further. The NIV and the today's New International Version is put in this chart pretty much in the middle, but actually it should go a little bit more to the right, more toward the more functional, okay? Now, I understand what they're trying to do on this chart because they're comparing the NIV and the TNIV to, like, you know, the Message, which is basically a paraphrase, and we'll talk about what a paraphrase is in a minute. But it's true that the further you get along on the line with the New Jerusalem Bible and the REB, I don't know, I can't remember what that stands for, and then the New Century Version and the New Living Translation, and then the Good News Bible and the Contemporary English Version, okay, they are a bit further along on the spectrum. For sure, when compared to the NIV and the TNIV. And then the Message is just out there, okay, as far as a translation that is, to me, it's more than functional. It's, as we said, a paraphrase, okay? And that, and as we define it here in a minute, you'll see that that's not very good. Not good at all, really. Now, so I think the NIV, again, being under the the functional approach, the thought for thought approach, still by myself and others would be considered a commentary. Okay, and again, recognizing that in many places the NIV has the best translation. But I'm still going to think of it as a commentary so that I don't get drawn into looking at other passages where they have not done a very good translation because they're trying to get their meaning across based on what they think the text has said. Okay? And as we'll see here in a minute, even the authors of our textbook, while they use the NIV in the text as their main text of when they quote things, they will recommend that we go toward the more formal side. Okay? Now, in slide 45, concerning the paraphrase, what is a paraphrase? A paraphrase is not a translation. It's simply not. What it does is it takes an English translation and it restates that English word or phrase using different English words in their mind. The translators or the people who put together a paraphrase, they're trying, admirably to get the Bible into, again, what they think is a simpler English, and so forth, that that can be read by more people. Okay, but what they end up doing is they end up sacrificing the original meaning for readability. And not only is the Message included in this category, but also the Living Bible and the Amplified Bible. And while a person might use a paraphrase simply to read, for enjoyment, or maybe in some devotional, situations, the paraphrase is not recommended for the serious study of the Bible, because it is, very much removed from what the text actually says. It actually works from an English translation to go to what they want to do with the paraphrase. So, the last slide that we have, slide 46, gives us some tips that we can use, some good guidelines, actually, that we can use to choose a translation that we are comfortable with. First, we want a translation that uses modern English. Actually, personally, I would swap this list. In fact, I will probably do that when I get done with this session, so that you can see what I think is more important here, and that is the last one I think should be first, and that is, you need to choose a translation that is more sensitive to the source language, or another way to put that again is to you choose a translation that uses the method of the formal approach. I would put number 2 there as number 2, a translation that is based on the standard Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek text. Thirdly, I would choose a translation that was translated by a committee, and I would, if I could do enough research to find out about the committee, I would choose a translation that's done by a committee that is, at the very least, evangelical, okay, that is the more conservative side of Christianity, and one that has people from across the spectrum, you might say, from evangelical Christianity. That is, you've got some very conservative churches in evangelical Christianity, and then you've got some not so conservative churches that still identify as evangelical. So I would, if I had the opportunity and the time to research the committee and where they stand as a whole on certain subjects, what universities do they teach in if they're teachers? What seminaries do they teach in if they're teachers? People from again more conservative schools would be people that I would put more faith in as far as their translation. And then lastly, I would choose a translation that uses modern English. That would be a little bit further. That would be on the bottom of this list, because, again, we want to be as sensitive to the source language as possible without being wooden or stilted as far as trying to get through it and understand it. Modern English is a necessary component in our choice, but it's not the first choice that I have for, again, a good study Bible where we're trying to get what God wants us to get from His Word. All right. That brings us to the end of chapter 1 in this particular slideshow. Let me close that down. I think we've got about 10 minutes left in this particular class. So what I'll do is I'll start into chapter 2 and present the PowerPoint for chapter 2, the interpretive journey. Again, these PowerPoints will be posted in the week or with the videos that in the week that contains the videos for that particular chapter. Okay, now this is session 5 and I'm starting into chapter 2. So I'm starting into chapter 2 actually at the end of week 1. So the PowerPoint for chapter 2 is going to be in week 1, but the videos that also will be in week 2 will also cover chapter 2. So you'll need to, again, open up the presentation, the PowerPoint from week 1, even while you're listening to videos in week 2 until I finish chapter 2. Okay, I hope that wasn't too confusing. All right, in the first slide we have a picture of our textbook and the title of this particular chapter, chapter 2, the interpretive journey. Now, the first question that is asked here is, why do people all over the world read the Bible? What we want to do here is think of the different reasons that people turn to the Scriptures. Some people will turn to the Scriptures because they are hurting or grieving, or they're going through a particular hard time in their life. Some people will turn to the Scriptures because they were raised in a family that believed in the Bible and the God of the Bible and seek the salvation that is found in the pages of the Bible. And there may be other reasons that people all over the world read the Bible. But in slide number 3, we want to get more personal with the question, why do you read the Bible? And in a format like this, with me just recording videos and not having face-to-face interaction, we certainly can't get any answers back from you, the students. But the idea is that we want to get across with this is the fact that for whatever reason that you read your Bible, the fact is that this class is about interpreting the Bible and grasping what God has said for us. The thing that we want to get across here is the fact that as you read the Bible, you already are interpreting. Now, because most of us have, years and years and years of use with the English language. I know there are some that are from different countries in this class and so forth here for different reasons, sports or whatever. But the fact is that when you read your Bible, you're interpreting, but you're not really recognizing the interpretive process because we're so used to reading in English. Okay, the people who have English as a second language are probably recognizing the idea a little more because they are having to stop and say, I don't know what that word means, or I need to figure out what is meant by this phrase in English because I know how I would say anything in my native tongue, but in English I'm not used to it. I'm not familiar with it as much. So the idea is that we, as normal English speakers, interpret without thinking about it, because when we read the sentence, let's just pick out John 3:16. Okay, for God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, and that whosoever believes in Him will not perish but have everlasting life. Okay, we don't sit there in our English experience and say, okay, for now let me think about what that means, and how is it connected to, or what's the connection between that and God so loved the world. Okay, and then God, let's see, that refers to deity, the one true God in heaven. And then the word so is actually a word of manner or means in the original language. I mean, you would have to read a commentary or something like that, or know the original language to know that. But even in English, the word so is used in that way. It might be that your parents, or your father, your mother, whatever, that were trying to teach you something, like, if a father is teaching his son how to drive a nail, okay, with a hammer, and the son is holding the nail wrong, and he's hitting his fingers and stuff like that. To begin with, the father might take the nail and the hammer out of his son's hands and say, no, watch me, you do it just so, okay, you do it in this way. Now, we don't usually talk like that anymore, but that is a valid way of using the word so. So in this case, in John 3:16, that's how it's used. That's how it's used. So you could be translating it, for God in this way loved the world, in that He gave His only begotten Son. This is the way God loved the world. But again, besides that idea of trying to get behind that and see exactly what the word so is talking about, again, for God so loved, if we're reading along, we look at the word love, it says, okay, that's sometimes refers to a feeling, sometimes it refers to an action. We don't go through that process. We just know. I mean, the fact is that we go through that process. Let me back up. We go through that process of doing that with every word we read, but we do it so fast because of our experience with the language, we do it so fast that we don't recognize it. Okay? So, no matter what you're reading, whether it be the Bible or your textbook or this slideshow or whatever, you automatically are interpreting. Now, again, what we're trying to do in this class is we're trying to give you tools with which to do your best to interpret the scriptures. Okay? And therefore use methods that will give us the best understanding of what Scripture means, because we are not here, as I think we've said in earlier lectures, we are not dealing with the Bible in such a way that we get to put our meaning on it. I mean, that's ludicrous. We wouldn't do that with any other document. The Constitution of the United States, the laws of our land, if we read through those and stuff, we don't get to put our meaning on it. We don't get to put our meaning, our definitions on the words that we read. We should understand the words for what they say. Okay? And that's the thing that we're trying to get to, and get there as best we can. So we will start in the next presentation with slide number 4 in the in this presentation, and we'll pick up there. As always, please remember that I'm here to help, and I'm willing to answer any question you have or help you with any problem that you have. So I hope you have a great day.